Please welcome to the program Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Peters, who served in the Army for 22 years. And then, in the time since he's been out, I guess, maybe he wrote some before, has written 31 books and a bunch of other stuff. Good morning, Lieutenant Colonel Peters.
Good morning, Don. Thank you for having me on. And please call me Ralph, because, I'm at a point in my life where when people call me Colonel, I feel like I should be wearing a white suit and selling fried chicken.
You know,
I did. Deal on that?
I did identify you as Colonel Peters, and then I got.
Yeah, well, it's a funny etiquette, but I don't want to do a Brian Williams and ever pretend I'm something I wasn't. My rank was Lieutenant Colonel, but the etiquette is once you say that, then it's okay to just say Colonel. But you just got to get it out there, because military people, understandably, are very sensitive about people who make claims that aren't true.
Have you ever?
Although, if we have time in the show, I would like to tell you about how Brian and Williams and I personally turned back the German panzers at the Battle of the Bulge.
You're an idiot. No, you're not an idiot.
No.
You're one of our American heroes. And by the way, thank you for your service to this country.
I'm not a hero. I've known heroes. Trust me, Don, I am not a hero.
Of course, I was
not even to my wife.
I was in the Marine Corps in the jungles of Vietnam, killing the Kong.
You were?
Well,
you did
actually,
more than I ever did.
Actually, I was playing the bugle since the 11th Marine Drum Bugle Corps at Camp Pendleton. But I would have gone to Vietnam had they asked me.
But everybody who served deserves our praise, but we're not all heroes.
On a far more serious note, Susan Rice, what's her position now?
Susan Rice is the National Security Advisor.
Do you know?
Now. Well, she was formerly at the UN.
Well, do you
now
know what her position is now?
She's the National Security Advisor.
God almighty. You're the newsman.
I was falling asleep over here, but I woke up just in time to give you that information.
She says ISIS is not an existential threat like the Nazis or the Soviet Union. And what do you think?
Well, I hate it. Don, in Washington, people don't think. We have these institutions called think tanks, the most wildly misnamed institutions in history. And people, there are more parrots in Washington than there are in the jungles of Central America. And you hear people parroting empty things like, oh, we can't kill our way out of this. Oh, yes, you can. Oh, there's no military solution. Well, sometimes in human history, there's only a military solution. And now the vogue phrase is existential threat. Well, with apologies to Sartre, Camus, and Céline, I don't think anybody really knows what it means, and Susan Rice doesn't. The only existential threat we have ever faced was Russian nukes. Existential means they wipe you out. The only existential threat to our government and being was our Civil War. And, and that was close and bloody. But, even the Imperial Japanese, while horrible, were not an existential threat. So stop the parroting of these words you don't understand, and let's deal with serious policy. And serious policy says, climate change may or may not be real, but ISIS is right now. You saw that young man burned to death last week. You've seen the beheadings, the mass rapes, the slaughters, the kidnappings, burying children alive, beheading children from watching a soccer game. Look, this is really, really serious. And by the way, Vladimir Putin hit his own reset button, and what's going on in Ukraine is an invasion on European soil. And the White House, they just want these problems to go away. It's appalling. It's appalling. I wish they would, but they won't.
I had to ask Bernard before I went on the air. I actually have a dictionary app on my phone, but I didn't have time to employ it, so I asked him what existential means, and thank God he told me, because I wouldn't have understood anything you were saying. By the way, speaking of the Ukraine, do you think we should arm these people?
Absolutely.
Oh, you do?
We absolutely should arm them, and we should send U.S. trainers to help treat. Look, sorry, but if you don't stand up to Hitler in 1936, you get hit in 1939. And I do honestly believe that the Ukrainians, they're going to collapse. Putin's going to keep gobbling more territory and killing more people unless he's stopped somewhere. And look, I don't like this. I'm a soldier. The great misunderstanding about soldiers is, oh, we're all warmongers. Look, I would love to be a Quaker, but we don't live in that New Testament world. We live in an Old Testament world. And it's the book of Joshua, not the Sermon on the Mount. And sometimes you've got to fight. And you fight early, and it's a lot cheaper than fighting too late. So anyway, should we arm the Ukrainians? Yes. Should we arm the Kurds? Yes. So that U.S. troops don't have to do the fighting.
Back to the ISIS threat and so on. The United States is already bombing them. What else should we do?
Well, you need to bomb effectively.
Yeah.
You do need eyes on the ground. And especially as we move toward combat in cities, if we want the Iraqis to have a chance of retaking the great city of Mosul, second largest in Iraq, or Fallujah, then we do need U.S. special ops on the ground to call in pinpoint airstrikes. The president set up a false choice between only airstrikes and hundreds of thousands of troops on the ground. Well, you know, there are middle grounds. Special ops do have a role. And just by the way, the president's right about one thing for sure. We never want to go back to the neocon folly of trying to turn Afghanistan into Colorado. We are not obligated to rebuild our enemies' cultures. The way what works, look, the world is a brutal place still. I hear people say, well, you can't put a price on human life. I can. In much of the world, it's cheaper than a falafel sandwich, and that's just the way it is. And if you want to reduce the threat to America and our allies, you've got to be willing to kill a lot of terrorists, because they are certainly willing to kill you.
What do you think of the president's remark at the prayer breakfast about the terrible deeds committed in the name of Christ during the Crusades 1,000 years ago in slavery?
Well, actually, I just had a piece up in National Review Online about comparing jihad and slavery. And the president and the left in general, they distort history. They've taken history instruction out of our schools. People don't know the truth, so they can claim anything. The Crusades lasted barely 200 years. They briefly took Jerusalem, held it for almost a century. They never reached Damascus. They were confined to a coastal strip. There are basically boorish tourists who eventually get kicked out. Jihad lasted 14th century. It is ongoing today. It never stopped. Jihadis, Muslim extremists, the Ottoman Empire, before them the Arabs, they conquered every single city crucial to the formation of Christianity. They occupied much of southeastern, southern, and eastern Europe for between 5 and 8 centuries, took tens of millions of Europeans into slavery over centuries. The slave markets of Istanbul, Damascus, Basra, Baghdad, Cairo made the slave markets of Charleston and New Orleans look like country stores. I'm certainly not excusing chattel slavery in America. It's one of the 2 great blots on our history, along with the treatment of Native Americans. But 1,400 years of jihad, the damage done to Europe was incredible, and even more damage to Africa, where the slavery never stopped. Yep. You know, Saudi Arabia finally outlawed slavery in 1962.
We have just
some
a few
human rights
seconds
activists think it's still going on.
Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Peters, thank you very much. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I had to cut you off. Yeah, but sure. You were great, and thank you very, very much. And thank you for taking the time to appear on the program. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Peters here on the Imus Morning Program.